All characters and events are fictional. Any resemblance is coincidental, and if you believe that every lie eventually leaves proof, stay with me. I didn't walk into that room expecting revenge. I walked in expecting confirmation, because by the time my family looked at me the way they did, with polite smiles, measured voices, and eyes already finished with me, I knew something important had already happened. I just didn't know how far it went yet. What I did know was that whatever decision they thought they were making that night, it wasn't the end. It was the test, and tests have consequences. The room was warm, too warm, the kind of warmth that makes people comfortable saying things they shouldn't. My father sat at the head of the table like always, straight-backed, calm, hands folded as if they were part of the furniture. My mother sat to his right, ankles crossed, expression neutral, the expression she wore whenever she had already agreed with him privately. And across from me sat my sister, perfect posture, perfect hair, perfect confidence. She didn't look at me like a sister. She looked at me like an obstacle that had finally stopped moving. That should have been my first clue. Let's not make this emotional, my father said gently. That sentence, that exact sentence, in our family it always meant the opposite. It meant a decision had already been made. I didn't speak. I waited, because I'd learned something important over the years. People who rush to silence you are usually afraid of what you might say after they finish. We've reviewed everything, he continued. Your situation, your choices, your direction. That word again. It was the same word he'd used when I chose my career, when I moved out, when I stopped asking for approval. It always meant control. My sister smiled slightly. Not kindly, not proudly, relieved. And that's when I understood something that made my stomach go cold. This wasn't about concern. It was about exclusion. My mother finally spoke. We just don't think it's wise for you to be involved going forward. Involved. She said it softly, like she was sparing me. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because nodding keeps people talking. Involved in what? I asked. My sister inhaled sharply. My father paused. That pause told me everything. There are certain structures in place now, he said. Responsibilities, assets, expectations, assets. There it was. Finally. The word they'd been circling like it wasn't the reason I was sitting there. I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms. Still calm, still quiet, still letting them believe they were in control. You'll be fine, my sister said suddenly, too quickly. She smiled wider, like reassurance was a performance she'd rehearsed. You've always been independent. In her mouth, it sounded like disposable. That was the moment, the exact moment. When I realized two things at once. First, they thought I needed them. Second, they had no idea what I already owned. But I didn't correct them. I didn't interrupt. I didn't reveal anything. Because the worst mistake you can make is exposing the test before it's finished. So I smiled, just slightly. And I said the one thing they weren't prepared for. Of course, I said, I understand. The room relaxed instantly. You could feel it. My father's shoulders lowered. My mother exhaled. My sister's smile became real. They thought I had accepted my place. They thought I was done. They were wrong. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that this conversation wasn't happening on equal ground. Because long before that dinner, long before the polite rejection, long before they decided who deserved a seat at their table, I had already stepped into rooms they didn't know existed. Rooms where names weren't inherited. They were signed. Rooms where value wasn't announced. It was documented. Rooms where power didn't raise its voice. It waited, and while they believed they were removing me from the future, I was measuring them quietly, carefully, patiently, because when people think you have nothing, they show you everything. I left that night without arguing, without tears, without asking for explanation. I hugged my mother, shook my father's hand, smiled at my sister, And when I stepped outside into the cool night air, I finally allowed myself one thought. Good. Now I know exactly who you are, because the next time we would all be in the same room, I wouldn't be asking for a place at the table. I would be deciding who was allowed to stay. I didn't cry that night. That surprised even me. I drove home slowly, hands steady on the wheel, the city lights blurring past like they always had. Nothing felt different on the outside, but inside, something had shifted permanently, because rejection hurts when it's unexpected. When it's planned, it becomes information, and information is power. By the time I reached my apartment, my phone buzzed. One message, from my sister. I hope you understand. This wasn't personal. That's when I smiled. Because when someone has to say it wasn't personal, it always is. I poured a glass of water, didn't turn on the TV, didn't check social media. I sat at my kitchen table in silence, replaying the dinner. Not emotionally, but structurally. Who spoke first? Who avoided eye contact? Who smiled too early? Who relaxed too fast? Patterns don't lie. People do. My family had always believed I was predictable, the safe one, the reliable one, the one who never rocked the boat. They mistook calm for compliance. They mistook distance for ignorance. And that misunderstanding had followed me my entire life. I grew up in a house where money was never discussed, but always controlled, not with threats, with expectations. You didn't get punished for disobedience, you got excluded. And exclusion in wealthy families is the cleanest form of discipline. I learned early how to survive that environment. By observing, by listening more than I spoke, by noticing what wasn't said, and by never revealing everything I knew. That habit followed me into adulthood, into my work, into the rooms I eventually started entering. Rooms my family assumed I'd never qualify for. I didn't work in anything flashy, no glamour, no public recognition. I worked in structures, ownership, compliance, risk, the kind of work that sits quietly behind glass doors while other people take credit for outcomes they don't understand. And in those rooms, I learned something my family never did. The most dangerous person in the room isn't the loudest, it's the one who already knows the ending. That night, after dinner, I opened my laptop, not out of panic, out of habit, because when something doesn't make sense emotionally, it usually makes sense financially. I didn't start with my family, I started with entities, trusts, holdings, shell structures, the boring stuff people assume no one reads. And within 20 minutes I found my first anomaly. Nothing dramatic, just a minor restructuring filing. Recent, quiet. The kind of update no one announces because it's meant to go unnoticed. But I noticed, because the entity name was one I recognized. It belonged to my parents. But the control signature didn't. I sat back in my chair, pulse steady. This wasn't betrayal yet. This was confirmation. I checked the date, filed 3 weeks earlier, right around the time my sister suddenly started inviting me to family dinners again. Smiling more. Asking casual questions. Are you still living alone? Are you thinking of moving? Work going well? At the time it felt like concern. Now it felt like reconnaissance. I didn't dig deeper that night. That's important. Because digging too fast makes you sloppy. And sloppiness is how people tip their hand. Instead, I did something much more effective. I waited. Over the next few weeks I became exactly who they thought I was. Quiet, agreeable, absent. I declined invitations politely, responded slowly to messages, let the silence do its work, and the more distance I created, the more confident they became. My sister started posting subtle things, not bragging, positioning, photos of rooms I recognized but wasn't invited to, captions that hinted at expansion, new beginnings, legacy. Another word families like mine love to weaponize. Then came the second anomaly, a transfer, not large, not alarming, but structured in a way that only makes sense if someone believes no one else is watching. And that's when I knew They weren't just excluding me, they were preparing for something that required certainty, finality. That was the moment I stopped being the daughter, the sister, the outsider, and became something else entirely. An auditor. I didn't confront them. I didn't ask questions. I didn't demand answers. Because confrontation gives people time to prepare, and preparation is how evidence disappears. Instead, I did what I always do best. I built a timeline. Every filing, every change, every signature, every quiet move they thought was invisible, and slowly, a shape emerged, not sharp yet, but undeniable. They weren't protecting the family. They were consolidating control. And control, when rushed, always leaves fingerprints. By the time my sister invited me to another dinner, smiling, warm, confident, I already knew two things she didn't. First, the test wasn't over. Second, they were about to fail it. Because when people think you've accepted exclusion, they stop hiding, and that's exactly when the real story begins. The second dinner invitation came on a Thursday. That alone was unusual. My family never hosted anything important during the week unless there was a reason. Weekends were for appearances, weekdays were for decisions. The message was short. We should talk. Just family. No emojis. No warmth. Just efficiency. That told me everything. I arrived exactly on time. Not early. Not late. Being punctual in rooms like that is a language. It says I'm not nervous. The house looked the same. Immaculate. Balanced. Untouched by chaos. Everything polished just enough to feel intentional, not obsessive. My father greeted me at the door with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The kind of smile you wear when you already know how a conversation will end. My sister was already seated at the table. Relaxed. Too relaxed. Her posture wasn't defensive. It was settled, like someone who believed the outcome was already locked. We exchanged pleasantries, weather, work, nothing real. Then my father cleared his throat. That was his tell. He never started conversations directly. He framed them. We've been reviewing some long-term planning, he said calmly. Just making sure everything is aligned, another favorite word. It means obedient when spoken softly. I nodded. Didn't ask questions. That unsettled him. People expect resistance when they deliver bad news. Silence forces them to fill the space. My mother finally spoke. We don't want you to feel left out, she said gently. But certain responsibilities require consistency. I looked at her, really looked. She wasn't lying. She believed what she was saying. That made her more dangerous than my father. My sister leaned in. You've always been independent, she said with a smile. This just makes things simpler for everyone. Simpler for them. I smiled back. I understand, I said, and I meant it. Because understanding isn't agreement. It's awareness. The conversation shifted. They talked around me, not to me. Future plans, investments, names dropped casually. And in that casualness, they made a mistake. My sister referenced an asset by its internal designation, not its public name, not its holding title, its internal code. That's the kind of detail you only use when you believe everyone at the table already belongs. And she didn't realize. I did. I excused myself early. No drama, no confrontation, just gratitude. And when I walked out, my father said something that sealed it for me. Drive safe, he said. Some roads don't forgive mistakes. It sounded like concern. It wasn't, it was confidence. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was upset, because I was calculating. I pulled every document tied to that internal designation. Old filings, archive transfers, dormant entities. And there it was. The false innocence, the decoy. On paper, the structure looked clean, impeccable even. Everything routed legally, everything disclosed, At first glance, there was nothing to challenge. No crime, no scandal, no headline, which meant this wasn't the real story. People who move money illegally don't overpolish their work. People who hide power do. So I shifted focus. Not on what moved, but on what didn't. Something was missing. A routine filing that should have been there, wasn't. A silence in the paperwork, a gap, small, intentional, and impossible to explain innocently. That gap told me two things. First, they were rushing. Second, they believed no one would ever notice. I requested one document, just one, from a third-party registry, no alerts, no notifications, and when it arrived, everything clicked. The entity didn't just belong to my family. It relied on me, indirectly, quietly, legally. My identity was part of the structure. Not ownership, not control, but authorization. They hadn't excluded me because I was irrelevant. They excluded me because I was essential. And they assumed I'd never realize it. That's when the weight of it settled in. This wasn't rejection. This was containment. I wasn't being pushed out. I was being used. And suddenly the polite dinners, the smiles, the efficiency, made perfect sense. They didn't laugh at me. They didn't to fear me. They simply believed I would stay aware long enough for everything to finalize. I closed my laptop and sat back, heart steady, breathing slow, because now I knew something they didn't. The structure they built couldn't survive without my silence. And silence, once broken, collapses everything. But I wasn't ready to break it, not yet, because the most satisfying endings are the ones no one sees coming. 2 weeks passed. That was intentional. If you react immediately, people get cautious. If you wait, they relax, and my family relaxed beautifully. The invitation came wrapped in generosity. A charity gala, black tie, prestige venue, my father's name on the sponsor list, and at the bottom of the message, almost as an afterthought, you should come. It would look good. Not we want you there, not we'd like you there. It would look good. That was my cue. I arrived alone. Not overdressed, not underdressed. Neutral elegance, the kind that doesn't compete for attention, but doesn't disappear either. And I noticed something the moment I walked in. My sister stiffened, just slightly. She hadn't expected me to accept. My father greeted donors with practiced warmth. My mother floated beside him, smiling, correcting small details. They were in their element, and for the first time I saw it clearly. This wasn't family. It was a boardroom with blood ties. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't bring up documents. I didn't ask questions. I did something far more effective. I listened. People talk when they believe you're irrelevant. They use shorthand. They drop assumptions, and assumptions are confessions waiting to happen. My sister introduced me to someone I recognized immediately. She didn't. He was a legal consultant, specialized in layered asset shielding, the kind you only hire when you're planning something permanent. She smiled as she said his name. Old family friend. He hesitated, just a fraction too long. Later that evening, my father pulled me aside, casually. "Everything all right?" he asked, concern without curiosity. I nodded. Of course. That answer unsettled him, because he was waiting for resentment, or questions, or distance, not compliance. "I'm glad," he said. "We're moving into a new phase. It's important everyone feels settled, like soil after something has been buried." I smiled. "I trust your judgment." That was the moment he relaxed. And that was my mistake. If I hadn't seen his shoulders drop, because confidence always leaks when it thinks it has won. 3 days later, the first email arrived, a request. Small, innocent, a signature confirmation, not on a contract, not on a transfer, on an acknowledgement. They didn't even send it directly. It came through a neutral intermediary. I stared at it for a long time, because this was the hinge. The moment where the story splits. If I refused too early, they'd pivot. If I signed blindly, I'd validate everything. So I did something better. I asked for clarification. Just one question, just enough. Not suspicious, not challenging. Professional. The reply came quickly. Too quickly. Rushed replies are panic wearing a calm mask, and there it was. The explanation referenced an outdated structure, one that no longer legally existed. A ghost. They didn't know it had been dissolved, because they weren't the ones managing it anymore. I was, indirectly, quietly. That night, I documented everything: screenshots, timestamps, language patterns. Not for confrontation, for contrast, because lies only matter when compared to truth. The next week, my sister called me. That almost never happened. She preferred distance. Dad mentioned you had questions, she said lightly. Questions, plural. When I had asked one, I just wanted to be careful, I replied. Details matter. She laughed, too loudly. You always were. Thorough. Her tone carried something else now. Alertness. She tried to steer the conversation. Remind me of favors, of childhood dynamics, of how much they had done for me. I let her, because guilt is another form of leverage, and I wanted to see how she used it. Before hanging up, she said something revealing. We're almost done. Just need everything aligned again. The word they used when they wanted silence. That night, I opened a file I hadn't touched in years, a dormant account, one my father had insisted stay inactive for safety. I checked its access permissions and smiled, because someone had tried to log in, recently, unsuccessfully. They were testing boundaries now, quietly, just like I was. The next event was bigger. A public announcement, new partnership, new phase. They were stepping into visibility, which meant the window was closing, and still. I said nothing. I attended, I smiled, I nodded. I let them believe the story they'd written was final. Because the most effective evidence is the kind collected while everyone else is celebrating. And they were celebrating. They toasted to unity, to legacy, to family values. But beneath the table, their structure was cracking. They just hadn't heard it yet. The announcement happened on a Thursday, mid-morning, prime time for credibility, press releases sent, emails forwarded, phones ringing. My family's name was everywhere. They had done it, or at least, they believed they had. I watched it unfold from my apartment, coffee untouched, curtains open, laptop glowing, because this part of the story wasn't emotional. It was procedural, and procedures don't care about intentions. The headline framed it perfectly. Family-owned venue enters new strategic phase under unified leadership. Unified. That word again. I received the message an hour later, from my father. Short, polished. It's done. I hope this brings closure. Closure. The word people use when they think there's nothing left to uncover. I didn't reply. That bothered him more than anger ever could. By noon, the celebration lunch was underway. Private room, glass walls, expensive silence. My sister sent a photo to the family group chat. Smiling faces, champagne glasses, her hand resting lightly on my father's arm. The caption, "We did it." And for the first time, I felt something close to satisfaction, because this was the moment. The moment they crossed from planning into execution, and execution leaves footprints. That afternoon, the second request arrived. Not an email, a courier, hand-delivered, neutral envelope, no logo, just my name, inside. A revised document, not asking for approval, confirming compliance. That was the shift. From request to assumption. They had already moved forward. They just needed the paper trail to look clean. I read every line, slowly, twice. And there it was. The same flaw. The same ghost entity, referenced again. Only now, it was irreversible. Because this time the document triggered automatic reporting. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Not relief. Focus. Because this wasn't the final evidence, yet. This was the lock clicking into place. I signed. That's the part people never expect. They think the smart move is refusal. It isn't. The smart move is precision. I signed exactly where required. No objections, no conditions, no warnings. And the moment my signature entered the system, the clock started. They felt it immediately. Not consciously, but something shifted. My sister called me that night, her voice lighter than usual. Almost gracious. I wanted to say thank you, she said. For what? For compliance, for silence, for confirming her belief that she'd won. You handled this with a lot of maturity, she continued. I know this couldn't have been easy. Easy. Another word they used when they meant finished. I'm glad it's over, I replied. That answer sealed it. 2 days later, the venue hosted its first event under the new structure. A gala, public, photographed, documented. Which meant liability had officially changed hands. I attended, late, wearing something understated, old shoes, intentionally, the kind people notice only long enough to dismiss. They laughed when they saw me, not cruelly, worse, indulgently, like someone indulging a memory. My sister leaned toward a donor and whispered something. He glanced at my shoes, smiled, looked away. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to, because ownership doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself. The speeches were flawless. My father spoke about legacy. My sister spoke about continuity. They used my name once, briefly, as context, not as credit. And then it happened, the moment they didn't realize mattered. A representative from the venue's oversight firm arrived, unannounced, polite, apologetic. Just a routine verification, he said. Routine, that word again. My father smiled confidently. Of course. Nothing to hide. Documents were requested, cross-checked, access permissions reviewed. And then the representative paused, just long enough. I'm sorry, he said, adjusting his glasses. There seems to be a discrepancy in controlling authority. The room stilled. My sister spoke first. That's not possible. Certainty without verification. A fatal combination. The representative nodded. It usually isn't. He turned to me. Miss Hart, can you confirm? Every face turned, confusion flickering. I didn't rush. I didn't smile. I simply met his gaze. Yes, I said, I can. That was the false ending. The moment they thought the problem was small, correctable, administrative. My father laughed lightly. These things happen, he said. We'll sort it out. The representative didn't smile back. I'm afraid that won't be possible, he replied. Silence. Not dramatic. Dead. Based on the documentation submitted, he continued. The controlling interest transferred upon signature. My sister frowned. To whom? He looked at his tablet, then up at me, to Miss Ava Hart. The room didn't explode. It imploded. My father stood, slowly, as if posture alone could restore authority. That's incorrect, he said, measured, calm, professional. The representative nodded again. Then you'll want to review the audit trail. That's when panic arrived. Not loud, not yet, but sharp. My sister's fingers tightened around her glass, too tight. My mother's smile froze mid-expression. My father didn't look at me. He looked past me, like he was recalculating. This is a misunderstanding, he said. The representative tapped his screen. No, sir, a pause. This is the result. They turned to me, all of them, waiting, expecting an explanation, a justification, an emotional reveal. I gave them nothing. Because this wasn't the final evidence yet. This was the setup. The moment they realized the ground had shifted, but didn't know how far, they didn't speak to me right away. That's how I knew it was serious. People only shout when they still believe they can win. Silence means they're recounting losses, The representative excused himself politely, said he'd return shortly. He never does when he says that, because shortly is when systems start talking to each other. My father finally turned to me, not angry, not confused, careful. "Ava," he said quietly, "there's been a misunderstanding." I didn't answer. I let the room do it for me. My sister stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "You don't even work here. Work, the word people use when they don't understand ownership." The representative returned, with another man this time. Different badge, different tone. This one didn't smile. "Mr. Hart," he said, "we need to address a secondary matter." Secondary, that word landed heavier than the first. "What matter?" my father asked. The man opened a folder, not a thin one, a thick one, tabbed, highlighted, prepared. An internal audit flagged irregularities tied to the ownership transfer, he said calmly. Specifically, the timing. My sister swallowed. The man continued. "Several decisions were executed under the assumption of unified authority." He paused, and that assumption was false. The room felt smaller, not because of tension, because reality had entered. My mother spoke for the first time. Soft, measured. "We've done nothing wrong." The man nodded. "That's what this meeting will determine." He turned his folder slightly, so everyone could see the header. "Notice of temporary suspension." My sister's voice cracked. "Suspension of what?" The man didn't look at her. He looked at me. Operations. That was when it broke. Not all at once, but piece by piece. The gala scheduled for that night, canceled. The next 3 events, frozen, vendor payments, paused, accounts, under review. My father finally raised his voice. "This is outrageous." The man didn't flinch. "Sir," he said, "you authorize these actions under an invalid assumption of control." A pause. "You expose the venue to liability." The word liability hung there, ugly, permanent. My sister turned to me, her face no longer polished, bare. "You did this on purpose." I met her eyes. Yes, that was the first honest moment we'd had in years. They argued, not with me, with systems, lawyers, procedures, and procedures don't listen to explanations. An hour later, the room was empty, just me, and the venue, quiet, still, mine. I walked through the main hall alone, the lights dimmed, the chairs stacked, the stage empty. I took out my phone, checked the timestamp. Because timing matters. That was when the final notification arrived. The one they never saw coming. Property registry update confirmed. I stopped walking, closed my eyes, and breathed. Because here was the truth they never understood. I didn't take the venue. I already owned it. They just forgot to read. My father called me that night. Once, I didn't answer. My sister tried next, text after text. Anger, fear, bargaining, silence. I didn't block them. I didn't need to. The venue had done that for me. The next week, the story shifted, quietly, no headlines, no apologies, just corrections. The board was restructured, management replaced, oversight tightened. And my family? They weren't invited. I stood in the main hall again, days later, new staff, new energy, same walls. I wore the same old shoes, on purpose, because power doesn't announce itself. It waits, it watches, and then it acts. They laughed when I arrived in old shoes. They stopped laughing when they realized they'd never owned the floor beneath them. And the truth didn't need a speech. It didn't need revenge. It only needed one thing: evidence. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to The Final Evidence, because every lie leaves proof.